Hey, Layman, welcome. Glad to meet with you this morning. If you couldn't see him because the camera's on me, he did a nice, slow waving pass here. And yeah, I reached out to you maybe a week or two ago after watching most of the Elusive I series and suggested that this might be something that we could dialogue on. I think they really produced a very, worthwhile and engaging inquiry. I think it's very pertinent to both the kind of the leading edge thought in integral circles and in metamodern and other spaces that we're concerned with, as well as more broadly and culturally. So I just thought it'd be fun to take some time to go into our responses and reactions to the recent Elusive I series and see what we can unpack from our own sides on our sense of the self and the I and the related territories of mystical experience and character and other things that orbit that.
Yeah, I love John, Gregg, and Chris. I had not been following the series until you mentioned that maybe we would do this. So now I've spent a week pondering my concept of selfhood. So it was pretty fun and exciting. Like my notes for this say self as a self-approximating hyperobject or hypersubject distributed rhizomatically over multi-state, multi-level emergent adjacencies, modulated dialogically and described in a manner coherently open to both naturalistic scientific ontology and deep participatory spirituality, which I think is pretty accurate, but it's a terrible title. So I was really thinking we should call this an I for an elusive I. And then that would have the for in there, and it would emphasize the prepositionality as well.
Nice. Well, I mean, I think with that title, we wouldn't have anything left to say, really.
Yeah, that about sums it up.
Yeah, right.
The elusiveness thing for me is really central. I was thinking about a board in history class in high school. I wrote this long surrealistic text and included some diagrams. And one diagram I remember was two stick figures pointing at each other excitedly. And the one of them says, "That's not me." And the other one pointing back at him says, "That's not me either." So that kind of, that structure of it has been with me for a long time. And I think it's really important. They touch on it a little bit in the series, but what I want to do in part is highlight that the elusiveness is not a function of our limited knowledge, but is structurally inherent to identities, which includes the identity of the self. Like others are not just larger than our perceptual and cognitive knowledge of them. They're all sort of like the digits of pi. They're asymptotic to themselves, and that's the structure of a thing beyond what we know about that thing. So I want to bring that kind of logic to the self at different levels and in different dimensions of our being, from the most primitive to the most evolutionarily developed and self-transcendental aspects of it. So that's kind of my overall gist. That's where I'll be coming at this from.
Great. Yeah. For me, there's immediate echoes in terms of my own sense of the self. I think looking at Buber and Rosenzweig and some of the people who've talked about the relationality of the self, obviously the self really shows up in that hyphen. And it's in that, cross-indexicality almost, where, the I beholding an it is never yet fully an I. The I only really begins to realize its potential in confrontation with a thou. But like with object-oriented ontology and the sense that the object itself always exceeds and escapes itself, that there's always this, withdrawn depth that can't be accessed. For me, I represent that with the wild knot image. And I think that, receding pi and the wild knot, that's just a visual representation of basically the same intuition. And there is some kind of constellating around that gathering that creates this ongoing cohesion of a sense of selfness. But there's not, it seems to me, any kind of final foundational layer or ground. It's this nesting interrelationality, prepositionality that I think is going to be something that we can go into and explore in more depth as we look at nature of the self. For me, when I was reflecting on the dialogue, a lot of what I was caught by was the discussion of the self and no self, and maybe some of the verbal correspondences, or the linguistic representations of the self, and whether the self is a noun or a verb, and things that they got into. Gregg and I have explored that a little bit in another video series, but I know you'd mentioned that you kind of wanted to go into language a little bit to set up our talk. So turn that over to you for a moment, and then I'll riff on it a little bit too.
Yeah, I think we want to highlight or make a little bit more salient some of the different grammatical structures of the lenses through which self can be viewed. And I think we also want to be aware of the kind of language that's necessary to have discussions like these. Like, there's a part in the series where the Verve asks about what kind of language can modulate between the language of a naturalistic ontology of the self and an interventionist or therapeutic modality, like explaining language and training language. And we're looking for an understanding of the self that can do both. But what's the language that encapsulates and moderates between that? And I think it is precisely the language of prepositionality. It is a language of in-betweenness. It's the intercontextuality language, the language of the hyphens. So I think we need to be almost like Hegelians and saying, like, we're not looking at an absence. We're not like, oh, what's the language of the in-between? The language of the in-between is the language of the in-between. We're not encountering an absence of knowledge. We're encountering the presence of a knowledge. The structure of the language that can describe a self, that can do both training and explaining, is a language that has to self-articulate itself as mediations and in-betweennesses and not quites and vanishing points, hyphens and slashes and things like that. So I think that's something you and I have been working on, and I think it could be important to make that more explicit. But here's my question for you is, a lot of people think of the self as specifically associated with the first person pronoun or the prepositional as view. How accurate do you think that is, given the fact that we can also talk about a self system? We can talk about it in an object fashion. Is selfhood available in your mind through all of the grammatical lenses, or is it specifically associated with the sort of I lens?
I haven't really considered that before, but my immediate intuition is that it is more broadly distributed and available through multiple grammatical modes. For instance, there's the feel of the self, which would be very adjectival, right? There's the sense of the presence of the self, which would be adverbial, right? There's the sense of the, identity, which would be related to the pronounal. There's a sense of the self as a system or an object, which could be related to the nounal. So there are all those different ways that I think, they can intersect, and in fact, they do intersect to support each other as an overall intuition of self, that all of those things intersect with each other. And, about the prepositionality, I think, and your reference to, Hegel and absence, I think it was William James who first remarked that we usually focus on nouns and verbs, and we pass right over conjunctions and prepositions without recognizing that they have their own feel and their own ontology. They tend to just kind of disappear as mediating elements between the things that we tend to focus on, at least in English. And for me, that relates a little bit to something like light. I look at light as a metaphor, that we never see light directly. We only see what light presents to us. And light, if we were seeing light photons directly, we wouldn't be seeing the objects. We would just see this brilliant field, but there wouldn't be any objects. So the light has to absent itself to some degree to make a phenomenological presentation of an object to us. And I feel that typically and habitually, while prepositions do have, a presence in an ontology, in our daily experience, they have a self-absenting function that helps present us the rest of the world in a sense. And that's, I think, why we naturally focus on some of those other domains, such as whether the self is a noun or a verb. And lastly, as to your suggestion that prepositional language is a language that's good for multiple domains, for both explaining and training, I definitely agree. As you know, Latour uses the preposition as a linchpin for his modal philosophy. It's the mediating point for the multiple modes of existence and modes of erudition that he maps. Prepositional language is partly what allows him to address and interrelate the modes in various disciplinary and interdisciplinary braids. You and I, of course, have been working on developing a prepositional metaphysics, which serves the explaining function. And in my conversation with Gregg, I suggested that the valence qualia that he and John explored in Untangling the World Knot can be understood prepositionally. They represent, for instance, certain from, to, and for, against relations. So that's one example of the prepositional in the constitution of the self, in addition to the adverbal and adjectival domains that they discuss. And I've mentioned elsewhere that I've used various prepositional framings and even exercises in workshops with therapists and students of psychology. That experience has given me a lot of encouragement, really, because I regularly get reports from people how useful the prepositional lens has been for them in better seeing, conceptualizing, and working with their therapeutic relationships once they've been able to put that lens on.
Well, I was thinking that we could each give a kind of overview of how we think the self operates or shows up in the system of the world. You know, the Gregg and John part of the discussion, and then move into the Chris and Kierkegaard and self-transcendence and soul and spirit part after that. So I don't know if you want to go ahead and kind of give an overview. I could do it. I think I'd need 10 or 15 minutes to, lay a picture out.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead with the picture first, if you don't mind.
Okay. I think Vervaeke is doing really good work building up a 4E cognitive explanation of how I'm something that models the world by modeling myself, and therefore I'm modeling a modeling procedure, which is myself. And I'm doing it with opponent processing dynamics that realize relevance and constantly adjust for an optimal participatory grip in a way that justifies the deepest features of civilization and subjectivity and dialogue and wisdom with a minimum set of necessary preconditions. So I think that's great. And I think that's a work that has to be done to help with Gregg's project of an integrated, coherent, multidisciplinary, non-reductive naturalism. And I think it speaks very well of that approach that John's using, that it reflects or underwrites the scientific method. Right. So the strategy of hypothesis compared to the analysis of observed data is very similar to rhymes with the cognitive interplay between predictions and the maps of predictions. And so with that general rubric in mind, which is sort of shared at the scientific method and shared at the level of how cognition functions, my thinking is the actual learning takes place in terms of discrepancy accommodation. Reminds me of Galileo. I think in one of his plays, he says the real science occurs when your anticipation fails. That's when you can learn the most. So we're constantly proceeding by adjusting predictions to close the discrepancy gap. But where does the discrepancy come from? Right? We could think of it as starting with a prediction and then that being compared to the data. We could think of we've got some data and we throw in a prediction and compare it. But we could also think that maybe the discrepancy comes first, that the comparative space must pre-exist in a certain way in order to afford the comparative option itself. So now I'm down right into the primitive guts of reality, right? This is what I keep looking at all the time, is this adjustable intelligibility gap, the adjacency gradient, the intercontextual feature having metaphysical priority. And that a lot of structure would have to be added and evolved before that started to look like a cellular economy of anticipate and compare networks. So the first thing I'm working with is the Ur structure of everything is that of something being itself by not quite being itself, and by doing this in relationship to something that is more itself than it is, but which also requires the one that is not itself in order to be that. All right, so a reciprocal constitutive deferral that's amenable to a range of proximal intensities. And we could mythically simplify that as a tripartite self of what you seem to be, what you are, and what you wish you could be, working together in all these structures. So that's where I'm starting. If I am my I, then the I who does the amming and the I who gets ammed have to be more similar to each other than any other thing, but also different enough to be compared such that an adjacency space in which comparison can occur can be established. I'm also thinking of it like a recursion loop. So this is still in the philosophical element of the self. If there's a recursion loop in self-reflection, the I before the journey of the loop has to be almost exactly identical to the I after the journey, but different enough to make available the fact that the journey has occurred. So there we are at the basis of things. If I come up from the super abstract level and start to ask, what are the first, simplest, self-like things in reality? I think we're talking about Whiteheadian prehensions or Nietzsche's notion of these proto-intentional centers of the will to power, right? In Whitehead, he's doing a move that's very similar to this architecture I'm describing in the sense of the bow and the wake of the boat, right? The experiential pole of an event being prehends and passes the prehended occasion to its object-like pole, but that includes recognizing itself as the prehender. In the Nietzschean scheme, that you've got these minimal flow-ons maybe, that make up reality, and they are primitive transcendence identities, right? Their urge is to perform a becoming, right? They're constantly trying to be what they aren't, which is what they are. So now we've got, this is the simplest level of actual reality, I think, and I think it's probably legitimate to think of these as minimal agents of some kind. So then I'm going to scale up from there, and I'm going to blow right past whether tornadoes and whirlpools are self-organizing enough to count as amplifiers of selfhood. I'm going to bypass whether crystals are alive, and we'll just come right up to the obvious level of organisms. Organisms are performing this same constitutive deferral loop in a number of much more complex and more interesting ways. I think the two really interesting things that you get at the organism level is a really explicit self-approximation in what Wilber would call the proximal distal loop. And he's generalizing from James's distinction between I and me. He's also generalizing from Robert Kegan's analysis that the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next. So this dynamic proximal distal loop is sort of more apparent in animal awareness. That's their structure of the self, but it's still the same kind of structure that we've been working with at all these scales. Wilber spiritualizes this, which is interesting to me, which is he sort of takes Eastern models of meditation and introduces the notion of a cosmic subjectivity that's enfolded into this more explicit proximal distal loop, right? So that the proximal self witnesses the distal self, which is and isn't itself, and that instantiates the role of the cosmic or just ubiquitous potential of self-witnessing. But I think what he doesn't get into very clearly is the fact that it's not just a proximal and a distal self, right? You're always not quite the one you were and not quite the one you're becoming. So the selfhood that's being instantiated in that loop, what's always present in that loop is that slipping past. That's what's being instantiated. And so that's what would characterize the potential or cosmic background subjectivity. The other thing that interestingly appears for me at the level of the organism in the stack is the possibility of self-contraction. Right? And I think this is linked somewhat to the role of bioelectric fields, which don't really come up in the interview series, the Elusive I. But I think we need to be aware that the toroidal structure around actual organisms is very much like a self-reflective information circuit, and that there are a lot of interesting scientific innovations which are positing that surfaces tend to control centers rather than to be controlled by centers. And so the extended electric field, which is present in all the organisms in which selfhood is explicit enough to be studied, are also electric field entities. And that may turn out to be a really significant component of selfhood. But those pulsatory electric field entities can get constricted, and we get this sense of self in organisms that we probably wouldn't see in pre-organismic proto-selves, which is the sense that I'm separate from the other. What we find I think typically in human experience as organisms is that sense is inversely proportional to our expansive, generalized, successful feeling of selfhood. And that one of the reasons we can say how yourself do you feel right now means that the self has some kind of variation or some capacity to be confused with another event. Like we very often feel, when I feel very strongly like I'm this one as opposed to that one, in hindsight, that's not my experience of myself. So I think we got to do what a lot of the 1970s spiritual teachings were starting to suggest and tease out a contractive field effect that generates a self-experience from the actual self-experience that goes along with the functional capacities of selfhood. So now we're up to the advanced animal platform, let's say. And now you got sophisticated animals, then you've got, I think, something analogous to self-transcendence, ethical behavior, tool use of some kind, embodied self-awareness. We've got this mirror phase self that we might say is applicable to a number of species and also to human infants, where they were piecing together a phantasmatic, imagistic map of the self, right? And it's a malleable, haphazard process. The map we can put together Frankenstein style doesn't perfectly map onto the body that we're distinguishing as a self entity. And therefore you got possibilities like body dysmorphia, where your picture turns out to be way off from what your body structure is. But the possibility of body dysmorphia is at the level of the mirror self. Again, that same structure of self being maximally itself and not quite being itself. There's a space of overlapping differential and incomplete identity between these things that are maximally identical. So that basic philosophical pattern is repeated there. I think that same thing happens again if we go up a little bit more sophisticated into, I think, what Gregg would call a narrative and justifying self, right? We pass through the domestic Oedipal gate into being socialized linguistic entities. And we can do that at a couple of different registers of complexity, where the self is the mythical protagonist in a world of stories, or the self is the subtle word hidden behind your name. Each of those, right, even just the self-reflective recognition of the fact that I have an I is going to exert that same structure, the elusiveness of it, which is non-problematic because it's constitutive of what an identity is going to be found there. In fact, it's almost the most direct experience we can have of examining the structure of an identity, just because we have access to it. Where do I want to go from there? Right. So then there's some kind of stabilization, right? There's some kind of embodied meta self who can evaluate or tweak and take an overview of multiple selves. We're getting into that existential somatic integrative Kierkegaard territory. But this evolving multi-self is more than symbolic. It's justifying itself in a new way, but it doesn't cease to be incompletely identical to itself, right? The very fact that it's a meta self, the very fact that it's encountering options and modalities of selfhood. Maybe it's encountering itself as a plural self. Maybe it's encountering itself as a developmental emergent multi-self. But in all of those cases, you're once again getting this all-pervasive particular elusive structure, not just an absence of information, but the very fact that you can only locate the self as a reference to the self that it maximally is, but incompletely is. So maybe I'll leave it there, because I think that layer of self is the way station beyond which you have to start talking about it in seemingly spiritual or self-transcendental terms.
Yeah, that was fantastic, really rich. And I think the play of deferral is essential. That's something that we've explored a lot, of course, on the Integral Post-Metaphysical Spirituality Forum, particularly with Edward Berge around Derrida's notion of difference, the joint difference and deferral of things, and how that's been taken up in some forms of object-oriented ontology, where not quiteness and slippage, withdrawal, excess are not just features of epistemological limitation, but ontic realities. I want to comment briefly on a few of your points before I talk about my own thoughts on the self. The first thing is Wilber's distinction between the proximal and distal selves. In that model, he also brings in the notion of the antecedent self, the witnessing self. I think it's an important element, and you touched on it some in your own response without actually naming it. One way that we could look at it in terms of John and Gregg's model is as the adverbial domain, the modal here-now togetherness that forms the kind of clearing for the other elements of consciousness and the self-experience to appear. But in the way that Wilber presents it, while it traces to various spiritual traditions, I wonder if it might be too fixed or static as a pre-given, unchanging, and eternal background which holds but is not touched by the play of deferrals. What do you think about that?
I would feel like there's probably a couple of different things that would have to be named differently that might be concealed by or pointed at with the notion of the antecedent self. It is interesting to think that there might be something that has to register the interaction between the I and the me. But I think that registration is probably best thought of as another example of that process, right? Like it's registering of the, it's an I looking at the me, and that me is consisting of the I-me relationship. So it's, I don't think it needs to be emergent necessarily. I think there's something, emergent meta self has a shape that's very much like that, but you can easily say, yeah, I think there probably has to be something in order to register, to act as if this process of selfing is actually occurring, but I don't see why that would be thought of as different than the process of selfing itself. Like I think like you're probably correct that it's a little bit too static. And then if you think of it as an activity, then it's another example of that activity.
Regarding your notion of discrepancy accommodation, that's a key insight in object relations theory and self-psychology. That self-structure is built in part out of the failure of parents at times to fulfill self-object needs. As long as the provision of those functions is good enough, as Winnicott says, then when we fail to receive those things, we have the resources to begin to enact those functions ourselves. He calls that transmuting internalization. The self-object is introjected, and in moments of discrepancy, of failure of expectation, we can begin to enact those functions ourselves and thereby fortify our own self-structure. And Eugene Gendlin, with his notion of body constitution, where body is understood as inseparable from and entangled with the environment, examines these dynamics at an even more basic level, as the taking in and ongoing implication of environmental elements in their absence. And this environmental implication becomes part of the operating structure of organisms. Concerning my own thoughts on the self, my view is informed by several streams, by integral theory, of course, by my training in transpersonal psychology and Buddhist practice, by object relations theory, self-psychology, and intersubjective psychology, by the general East-West dialogue in psychology, by Varela and Maturana's notion of autopoietic systems, by David Bohm's work on thought as a system, and more generally by living systems theory. There isn't full agreement among all of these elements, but the general picture emerging from their intersection is that the self is an intersubjectively or interdependently arising, process-relational, emergent, embodied, inactive autopoietic system that is a non-summative whole, meaning that in its emergence and ongoing consolidation, it is both more than and less than the elements that constitute it. It's self-maintaining through negative feedback processes, and it's self-transforming through positive feedback processes, and it's holonic in its multi-layered moments of prehensive unification, or in integral terms, tetra in action. David Bohm, for me, was one of the figures who brought in the fourth E that John mentions, that the self, as the locus of the thought system, is also extended in the world. John's model of recursive relevance realization and Gregg's notion of character adaptation systems theory are quite consonant for me with this overall picture. But the overall general shape of the self that they outlined in the Elusive I was already familiar to me through these other streams. I think they've both filled in some very interesting and important details, which I really appreciated. But I was also rewarded by the not newness of the model that they presented, because it validated for me the model that has already been emerging from these mostly extra-canonical streams, like transpersonal psychology and East-West dialogue, as well as integral theory or Jorge Ferrer's participatory model of psychology, where autopoiesis plays a very important role. In transpersonal psychology, a fairly common model of self-development is that insight into the dynamic, processual nature of the self is an important transitional stage. when, especially during existential crisis and passage, we gain insight into the dynamic, emergent nature of self as system, this sets the stage for loosening identification with these structures and opens the way towards the emergence of transpersonal modes of being. An important point here, I think, is that in most of the transpersonal and East-West psychological models that I'm familiar with, the ego and the self are not regarded either as totally illusory or as mistakes to be rejected. The ego and self lack inherent self-existence, meaning they do not exist from their own side as fundamental, self-contained, non-relational atomic elements or eternal substances. But in this regard, they're exactly like tables or chairs or other worldly objects. They conventionally exist and may even have causal efficacy, but they are dynamic, emergent processes, not permanent, fixed things that exist fully in and as themselves without any relational deferral. So John's argument about this in The Elusive I would be well received by and familiar to most of the transpersonal and East-West theorists that I know. They do imagine modes of being beyond identification with various ego or self structures, but many of the various functions of the self traced out by psychology and cognitive science remain important. As Jack Engler used to say, you have to be someone before you can be no one. But in that no one status, most ego functions, for instance, still remain intact.
It is reconfirming, like you said, to hear them have this dialogue. And not that, I mean, most of these ideas are not new. There's still an effort to bring it into the heart of how psychology understands itself and the heart of the scientific enterprise of cognitive science. But the fact that well-read, thoughtful, deep people can come together in dialogue and regenerate the same kind of image that a lot of people who've been trying the same kind of work have also been regenerating should give us a lot of confidence that we're onto something. And that notion of, you know, the simple idea of opposing the anatman as a no self to the self. All right, that's a great training wheel. It's introductory. If all you have is a clunky, static, antitative version of self, then by opposing a non-self to it, you actually you afford the whole range, the whole gradient of adjacency between these. But if you look more deeply into that, you get a much more enriched perspective that I think requires and is produced in people who take the science seriously and do the inner practice, is that their sense of self is more process-like, it's more plural, or I might say hyper-object-like, and it's intrinsically open. And that this is what anatman or a non-self is pointing to as the nature of the self. Right. So I think we're all looking at a space in which a selfing activity is occurring. We're all looking at a space in which the entity, if we want to use that term, is rhizomatic, or it's like an octopus, but right. And one of its legs is at the I, and one of it's at the me, and one of it's at the imagistic self, and one of it's at the justifying self, and one of it's in the primitive philosophical architecture, and a bunch of them go into the different modular subselves that might make up the psyche. One of them goes to the self-transcendence point of the self. So all of these tentacles are related to this thing. And you could say, yeah, that's an object. It's a hyper object. It's a hyper entity of some kind. It has real structure, but it's an organic, multifaceted structure. So it's a dynamic structure and an organic, multifaceted structure. Maybe think of these tentacles as being made of the selfing activity. And then it's intrinsically open, right? It's not that there's no use in reifying reality and treating it as things. It's when you look at anything, it's like Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's never perfectly closed. The fact that it can be in adjacency, that it can be in relationship dynamically, means that it's open to something beyond itself as part of its own architecture. And I think that's what we discover about the self that leads people to say, well, there really is no self, because when I look at it, I find relationship. I find nothing that's closed. I slip past it when I reach for it. But we can pull back from that and say, okay, that's the structure we're describing. That's what we want to call the self, is that dynamic, integrated, multifaceted, slips past itself thing, produces all of those effects that we would like to call no self, but actually that's the definition of self that we're looking for. And it is justified by intelligent analytic experience of in deep interiority and altered states of consciousness, as well as the information we're getting neurologically and through psychosocial studies on people.
Right. That discovery of the relationality, that ever slipping relationality where you can't find any ultimate foundational ground that is complete in itself. That basically, to me, is the fundamental insight behind anatman. It's not saying that there's no thing there, but that there's no thing that has intrinsic self-existence, meaning that it exists only by itself in total completeness without any deferral or relationship to anything else. That you can't find anything that just sits there fully atomically and self-enclosed and self-constituting and acausal. You don't find that. You find only this slippage, and you can't basically, there's a kind of groundlessness in that, but there's also a freedom and a stability in discovering that the nesting of the relations. From my side, in the Buddhist teachers I've worked with, and some of the ones who are working on these integrations of Western and Eastern psychology, that's always been the case in terms of recognizing that we can point to what the West describes as the self and the ego system, but it has the nature of anything else, which is this constantly set of deferring relationships without any ultimately self-existing ground, in any fundamental particle or they also talked about why we want to move against any kind of model that would be reductionistic down just to some base level, and then that would negate everything above it. So there's simultaneously a cancellation and an affirmation of things at every level, in the sense that they are both there and present and presenting and unfindable, in terms of unfindable as self-constituting, self-intrinsically existing object.
Yeah, I think that's something, obviously we're emphasizing that a little bit more, which is that, because I think they don't always say it, but it's implicit in a whole bunch of the arguments that are made, which is that the elusive I is almost inherently elusive, that you need a structure like that to define the self. But the part that we really seem to be emphasizing is that that's true because it's true of identities in general. It's a subset of what identities are. They are all like that. They're elusive in their own architecture. And,
exactly.
I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the spiritual dimension, because I was thinking about it. It's like there's three facets to this. If we're gonna here you've got a person who's at a narrative justifying cultural self, and maybe they're at it in a kind of primitive mythological way. Maybe they're at it in a very rational, formal way, or maybe they've sort of worked on this experience of holding a dynamic, evolving plurality, meta self. So you got there's a range of this narrative thinking, and then there's what do you do? Where do you go from there? Right. On the one hand, there's a whole spiritual literature around trying to decompress or return to dynamic flow the self-contraction, to separate out the self-contraction activity from the actual self-experience. So a lot of spiritual practice is that kind of insight and release work, where it turns out it's not that you're not a self, it's that the thing that feels like the self isn't necessarily the self. And then there's in my integration surplus model, I would say something like the development of soul, right? Rather than soul just as a possession. See, it seems more like a potential that's evoked either by life circumstances or by life practices to recognize the not quite yourself, the plurality of the subjective subsystems at their different scales, and start to bring those together. And that space of integration, again, presumes that things can be in a variable intensity gradient of adjacencies up to the point of harmonization. But then, so that's release the self-contraction, develop more soul, bring it forward in your life more. But also there's this thing that Chris did a fantastic job, I think, of delving into Kierkegaard. And for me, I read Kierkegaard a little bit through Gurdjieff, but Kierkegaard is trying to say there's a really radical rupture. There's a leap to the post-justified self. And I think there's a bit of an ambiguity about that, because that the experience of a no self or a transcendental self or a post-justified self is a very specific threshold in this stack. And what it's doing and the way you have to enact adjacency to do that is different than the way you enact adjacency at any of the other scales. So the things that Kierkegaard says are necessary for real selfhood in his mind, that's different than what the chimp has to do or the 5-year-old has to do. But the same underlying architecture is present. It's just that he's talking specifically about a post-conventional move. He's not talking about what necessarily constitutes selfhood at all scales. And that move is beyond the justifying self. And what is it like to be a self beyond the justifying self? It has to be perfectly just self-justified and utterly unjustified, right? It has to combine the maxed out extremes of the whole range of justification. And that's why I think Kierkegaard has to express it in terms of absurdity, right? In the same way that paradox seems to be essential to the structure of Zen koan work, right? Something has to completely max out the justification circuitry in order to even be available as an option for being a post-justified self. And yes, I think, sin and remorse, I think Kierkegaard's right on, is that part of what you do in all of these spiritual procedures is open up a richer dimension of self-transformation, which is opened up to you by feeling that you're failing to be yourself. That's your first authenticity move in this more elaborate direction. But it gets up to this really radical point that the non-dualists have worked on, and people who have all kinds of embodied God-man versions, not just the Christian version, but that's a fine language to talk about it in. They're describing something that I want to call it Cartesian, right? Like Descartes says, hey, I'm going to doubt everything, which means all the symbolic information that's framed in my capacity to experience the world as justified or unjustified in some kind of narrative coherence. I doubt all of that information. Let's take all of that off the table. So Descartes trying to do a similar move to Kierkegaard. And what he discovers is there's two things left, right? The self and God. But it's the self that is maximally itself without completely being itself. It's the I that is I, but he has both of them, and they can't be justified by anything else. And the fact that they can't be justified by anything else is what Descartes wants to call God. I feel like there's something more about that.
For me, I don't want to stop your train of thought. If you're ready to go out.
You go ahead. I'll try to figure out what I wanted to say about Descartes.
Well, that was to me just connecting to Roberto Assagioli and his two eyes, basically, which is similar to what you were just saying with Descartes, and that Assagioli distinguishes between the ego and the I. And for him, the I is the center of awareness and will, which is basically what's left when you do the neti move of saying, I am not this, I am not that. And you basically strip away all levels of identification in terms of Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry and who am I and who am I? And there's a gradual negation process. And for Assagioli, what remains as in some sense, though not wholly self-justifying, is the I, which for him is a singular pointless point of awareness and will, which is mobile and transcendent immanent. And John and Gregg, and they talked about, for instance, the sense of self or I being locatable, that you can feel it in the heart center, you can feel it up here between the brows, and the I is immanent in that it can identify with basically any part of our biological or overall self system. It can identify with images, it can identify with and merge with and be present within and as that part of us. At least it can feel that way phenomenologically, that it is and it as radiates as itself here or wherever. But it's also transcendent at the same time, in that it can encompass any one of those things. It can move out. It's not stuck in identification anywhere. So it's mobile. But the reason he would say it's not inherently self-justifying is that basically the I that we experience, he says, is merely reflection of the larger universal I, or presence, or knowingness, or God. So there's that similar Cartesian kind of move there.
That's similar to what we were saying earlier about the way Wilber thinks of the self system as embodying the relationship to that all pervasive. And then, I mean, the thing that's been spoken of in spiritual traditions going way back, but I think what they didn't often articulate really well was that the dynamic reciprocal self-reflection element that's available in the self system must also be present as they, right? It's not a weird failure to be the complete omnipervasive homogeneous cosmic I. It's a very good depiction of that basic shape. And I'd like to come back to spiritual life and transcendental life, and maybe the Stoics and Christ version of this, now that we're in a Kierkegaard spirit zone. But I think the thing I wanted to say about Descartes was, I mean, the first thing he does is disconfirm all of the narrative possibilities available to you through cultural symbols. And then the only thing that could be confirmed under that condition is the possibility of confirmation, right? There's a variable gradient of justification, which would be left over because it was the thing that enabled all possibilities of justification, is how justified is it? So the only thing that could justify itself would be as if the possibility of justification in any degree was itself self-justifying. So I think that's where Descartes ends up. And he talks about it in terms of the I, and maybe he held it in a clunky way, or maybe other people heard it in a clunky way. But I think he's saying the possibility of validation, the possibility that I am here as one who could evaluate how real something is, that's presupposed by all of this. Right. I don't have to call that my I necessarily, but I am a possible confirmer in some degree. And that is a breakthrough to a really precise description of this sort of interactive adjacent self structure that we're talking about. It's the fact that the self can be in some degree itself is an availability, it's an affordance of a degree of confirmation. And that's the only thing you have confirmation of beyond all the things that could or could not be confirmed. So that's your window into the post-justified self seen through an adjacency lens. And I think it's true that that's implied at every level and in every form of the selfing activity, so all the different kinds of selves. But I think in its explicit form, it has this transcendental distinction to, I don't want to say the merely spiritual life, but they're distinct, right? And this is the reason I think why Kierkegaard is at such great pains to make a critique of the Hegelian system, right? Because Hegel gives us a very reasonable, evolving, integrative model where things can keep developing and improving and enfolding their opposites. That's great. But Kierkegaard wants to say something slightly different, that there's an existential move that is not involved in the reasonable integration, that it only comes at the expense of the reasoning function because it involves this really explicit unearthing of the justification system. And that at one point, John was talking about whether we need Christ in Kierkegaard's sense, or whether the Stoics' idea of sort of bringing forth your inner sage, the bodhisattva that you are, is enough in terms of a serious play that instantiates this self-transcendence structure of the self. And I think it is important to distinguish them, right? Like you could think of Christ, the Christ character, as an illuminated human being, right? As this divine other person that helps you coordinate yourself past its reference point to be yourself in the right direction. But Christ and Christ on the cross are maybe a little different, right? The crux of Kierkegaard's position is that there's an absolute rupture between the full embodied force of the paradox, in which you are in a place where justification no longer applies, that the capacity for justification is self-justified, and you are in relationship to that. And in a way, all questions are pre-answered. You can't even make a move from that space. And that space opens up a very radical kind of spiritual life, a very non-dual function that isn't necessarily present in the person who's continually becoming themselves, continually getting deeper, continually cultivating and bringing forth the soul in all its subtle dimensions. That those are both really important, but distinct ways that self-transcendence shows up beyond the normal narrative self.
Yeah, that's really well put. And it's putting me in mind of a couple models that approach this from a different angle, but I think take you to a similar place. And one of the things that I wanted to bring in, I don't know if you're going to get to Lacan or not.
I should have brought him up when I mentioned the mirror stage, because the Lacan's really good at emphasizing how the self is constituted for the other or through the other, that there's minimal self-reference through the other back to the self, and that builds the not quite self into the self in the way we've been talking about.
Exactly. And Kohut does that as well with his idea of the idealizing and mirroring self objects. And for me, Christ, that's one of the functions of Christ, or other, deity figures in different cultures. But especially, I think, in Christianity, where it's so foundational to form a personal relationship with Jesus, or with Jesus Christ, that that image can serve as the self-constituting mirroring self-object, and the self-constituting idealizing self-object, where the mirroring self-object basically validates you in your being there, and the idealizing opens up a horizon of aspiration, and that both are there, that there's this absolute validation of there's nothing else you need to do to be you and to be okay as you, together with there's all of this possibility that's yet there, latent within you, that can be realized. And my showing up here wakes up echoes in your own being of your own horizons of becoming. So there's a simultaneous function of complete affirmation as is, and opening up a horizon of possibility at once. And I think what you're saying with Kierkegaard and Lacan both relate to that, in terms of how the Christ image, the Christ being, can function in the development of the self.
Yeah, and I feel like I want to say again that there's two modes of that, or like a general and a specialized mode, right? So that the idealized other and the idealized self-image, they form part of, I call it, I try to simplify the adjacency thing at the beginning by talking about the who I seem to be, who I really am, and who I could be, who's more me than I am, right? And so together that triangle is always at work. And so I always have this presence, and I can be more explicit about it. I can be more devoted to it. I can work better between these things, so that the one I seem to be is much closer to the one I am, and the one I am is always more and more becoming the more myself that I could be.
Right.
And Christ is one of the many ways that that better me can be conceived, because something has to fulfill that role, because it's part of the self-identity. It's not an additional option to the self-identity. However, I think Kierkegaard is trying to make a very specialist form of that, which is that ideal self points toward an impossible thing that makes all of it possible, right? So that the God as the possibility of all possibilities for Kierkegaard is a little bit like my unusual reading of Descartes, which is the self-justifying potential for there to be different grades of justification, that's magic, right? That's prior to all of the things that could be confirmed or not confirmed. It is the possibility of all possibilities. And to encounter that directly is experienced phenomenologically as a rupture with the complete set of possibilities, even the complete set of possibilities for the self that is constantly itself by becoming more than itself, right? So then you get these spiritual teachers who say, yes, the thing I'm talking about is absolutely impossible and absolutely infinite and always already the case, and in a way has nothing to do with your spiritual life. Right? It's a complete existential rupture. Now, I think rupture is probably a more violent than necessary way to describe it because it's built into all of these. But I think Kierkegaard is focusing, as some great mystics have done, on the sort of the terminal intensity of adjacency, right? Where they're as approximated as they can possibly be to the point where you can't make a move when you contemplate the potential reality of that. And that's a specialized subset of the religious practice, but there's a good argument that it's the most refined explication of the underlying dynamic, not only of all spiritual selfing, but of all selfing at all scales, which is what they then say about it. You're like, this is the self upon which the world is based.
That is a kind of grace. Yeah. It's just sheer, irrational gift.
Right, because it couldn't be justified by anything other than the capacity for things to be justified. So there's it has to be grace because you can't posit another thing in a semantic context that makes sense that would justify it. It's prior to that.
Right. Another track I wanted to bring in, related, I think, a little bit to, the idealizing horizons of the self, has to do with kind of part of our narcissistic structure, whether it's, our early infantile narcissism or latent narcissistic structures, even if we do develop beyond that. Wilbur is famous with his, pre-trans fallacy and wanting to distinguish between, mystical experience and infantile states of fusion, right? And not just reduce it all down to infantile states of fusion. But there's actually arguably some roles that those narcissistic structures nevertheless play in even the realization of mystical experience, that there's not just this stark divide between them. It's more how they're held and worked with than an absolute difference in being or identity. But anyway, what I wanted to say, there's a distinction between the ideal ego and the ego ideal that are both kind of part of the twin modes of narcissistic structure and narcissistic ways of being. And both of them are left over from that early state of infantile blissful fusion with mother and with the sensory motor surround, right? The ideal ego is the sense of the self as being real, unchanging, precious, and the good, right? And the ideal, that's the ideal ego. And then the ego ideal is basically that towards which we want to move, that with which we want to merge, that horizon of perfection that calls us and pulls us, and that we want to participate in that for our own well-being. And both of those elements are present, in they basically, after the state of fusion, when the ego begins to develop, they split. And in a narcissistic individual, they both remain constant, and you can see that in the splitting behavior that they engage in, where they're either narcissistically idealizing others or insisting on their own specialness. But the reason I wanted to bring this in is the way it interfaces with meditative work and contemplative work. I'm just going to look at it because there's, as you know very well, many different types of meditation, so I'm only going to focus on this, and I'm going to open it up to some other stuff later. But first, if you're looking in the context of like Theravada Buddhism and basic mindfulness practice, there are two elements of that. There's concentration and there's mindfulness. And concentration generates stability and a foundation, and also states of bliss. And then mindfulness is basically awareness of typically rapid arising of multiple objects while remaining stable. And the concentration component of the training enables you to actually remain stable in the face of the arising of multiple psychic elements for insight into them and integration. So in Theravada practice, they say that there's a dance between terror and delight. And delight, it's the bliss states. Terror is typically arising when you're experiencing the dissolution, the rapid arising and dissolution of elements of your world that you took to be always there, always reliable. Your thoughts, your identity, your feelings, your perceptions, your whole self-construct. As you progress in insight meditation and mindfulness meditation, you can begin to see more and more the momentary, the temporary, the constructed nature of all of those things. And that can be very disturbing and can strike existential terror in the heart of the practitioner. And so as the Theravada practice works, ideally, concentration practice serves not only practically for you to have a stable mind in order to be present to multiple very subtle presentations in consciousness, but also you could say to have a kind of narcissistic buffer, a bliss that you can aspirationally move towards, and that provides sustenance while you go through the experiences of terror. And that basically what happens is, concentration activates the ego ideal, that that field of bliss that towards which you want to move and with which you want to merge, and which provides some kind of sustenance to your being. And that mindfulness works on the ideal ego. Basically, it works to break up and dissolve the ideal ego, the sense of the ontological ground that you have relied on and identified with, and that both of those need to play together. If you don't have enough of work, enough investment in and work with the concentration element, the movement towards the ego ideal, then you can really be disturbed and disrupted, and your meditation practice may fail, or lead to trauma or other issues with the experience of the rupturing of the ideal ego. And if your ideal ego is not well developed, you can, in pursuing concentration and then mindfulness through that, get lost in idealized states, kind of new levels of projection of ego ideal, now forming a spiritual identity, right? So a lot of meditation teachers feel like people with borderline symptoms, aren't really constitutionally ready to do intensive meditation work. And it's typically, avoided, though they sometimes might allow for concentration practice without moving into the dissolving mindfulness, and because there's not enough structure there yet, but we all have latent narcissistic elements. And I think, that play of working with the ego ideal and the ideal ego makes sense in terms of, what we're doing in cultivating mystical experience and transitioning through older foundational structures into new modes of being. Couple things there that I'd like to expand on, but I want to stop there and see if there's anything that resonates first.
Sure. Made me think of, I mean, there's this threshold when you're deconstructing elements of your current identity or its complementary world space, when you could move forward or fall back from the level that you're deconstructing, right? So if you have certain kinds of advantages, such as practices or life activities that tend to allow you to successfully organize many of your components into a coherent field that you can experience some pleasure and satisfaction with, and which affords you a skill where you're likely to be able to put a bunch of pieces together, then that deconstruction is more likely to be able to help you put the pieces together in an expanded way to self-organize at a new level. If you don't have that skill and that confidence, then there's a risk that you're going to fall back. Mm-hmm. And I think this is in many layered selves, such as ourselves, there's always this possibility of a regressive move.
Right.
And I think when I was talking earlier about the self-contraction in sentient beings, I think the self-contraction is the sign that you're using a simpler layer of your self stack in some area than the one for which your totality is currently adapted. Right. So it's a regression, and it's a regression to something simpler. We can imagine that as smaller, and a smaller self space is going to feel tense and separative relative to the bigger space, but it's also going to behave in a way that will look narcissistic to others. Right. And it doesn't have to be the narcissism of the simple architecture of the ideal ego and the ego idea that we set up in the womb, but that's one good example of it. It could be anywhere, in the gradient of this stack, that we could fall back to a smaller self and a smaller sense of world. And then we're experiencing that, oh, this is me. And it's also not quite me experience, but in a regressive fashion, because we're lacking the supportive conditions. One of those supportive conditions being the mind skill that you might get through concentration meditation, but there'd be a whole number of other things that would also make that difference. Like if you were more loved as a child, right? If your health is good, if you've got enough iron in your blood, these things could all also make that kind of difference. But if the difference isn't made, then a lot of these experiences, including the experience that would be a normal, healthy attempt to grow beyond your current self, put you at risk of slipping into those more primitive patterns. And I think in terms of the terror, I want to say again, there's two modes of that, right? That despair and sin come up in the Kierkegaard description, but that sense of terror of, a visceral experience that I'm not myself. Now I'm here being that comparison. So there's that adjacency structure, but that feeling of failing to be myself affords me two different options. One is the ongoing development of becoming myself more and more, but the other one is the sidestep to what is the thing that is secure, even if myself fails. And I think that's the Kierkegaard move, and that's the pre-justified and post-justified structure.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree that there are many other kinds of supports along the way, and different transitions at different levels that or not all going to involve the ideal ego and the ego ideal, but that's exemplary of transitions that can happen at later stages. But one reason I wanted to bring that in is, I'm thinking of a structure, something like David Michael Levin talks about, where we initially have in our sensory expression and experience these kind of oceanic modes, often marked by bliss, but sometimes also by terror and overwhelming intensity, but kind of oceanic modes of vision and hearing that are part of the kind of the early fusion of self and world before the differentiation of self and world. And so it is primitive in that sense, but there still is an oceanic quality to that then is left behind as we socialize, but in later stages can be contacted again, now from a different place, and then reintegrated. There's still the echo of that oceanic mode of participation in our organism. And at later stages, we can reach back and contact that and now bring it up and bring it forward and have it now function in a new way in part of the constitution of our being. So there's this reclamation of aspects of the primitive in the higher, so that there isn't just this neat, clear, clean divide between, say, the narcissistic and the mystical, that they're just radically different, but they could be partly the same stuff, but reconfigured according to our present station of development. So one thing I wanted to talk about is, some possibilities that have been explored in recent research by Jeffrey Martin on kind of some of the, there are a lot of different models out there, and there's, Cook-Greuter and Terrio Fallon, and a lot of different ways that we could explore the transpersonal territory. But I wanted to just bring up something with Jeffrey Martin, in part because of some of what you just talked about in terms of different paths and how you hold the self, and whether you're living in becoming or whether you're living in the pre and post justified sense of self. He maps out many, many different kinds of locations that in his interviews with people around the world who have moved into some post-egoic mode of experiencing and self-organizing. He's mapped out at least 9 or 10 different locations, but really only been able to find a good number of exemplars in locations 1 through 5. So, for instance, in location 1, people might transition into that without even noticing it at first, because it's a subtle enough change, but gradually they can begin to discern a number of things that have changed in their sense of self and world. One of the markers of location 1 is just an ongoing sense of the okayness of things, of a fundamental well-being, even in the face of existential lack, terror, emotional suffering. All of these things can still be experienced, but underneath that, there's a conviction that the world is okay, that there's a fundamental well-being that can be relied on. And in location 1, there tends to be some reduction in the activity of the narrative self. And so in that reduction, then there's a new perception of stillness or silence that people start to pick up on. There's an expanded sense of the self, where there's a feeling that the self somehow goes beyond the boundaries of the skin and is part of the world in some way that's not yet very clear, but there's an expanded sense of self beyond the body. There's a sense of new completeness and a lessening of seeking. There's lessening interest in having to get somewhere or arrive somewhere, and more okayness with being where you are. There tends to be more present-centeredness, less time spent in memory or anticipation. There's less interest in stories, both in the story of oneself and even in the news or in reading novels. Some of that drops away. It doesn't seem as important to find out what's next. What's next? Positive and negative emotions are still present, but the relationship to them has changed. Again, they can just be held a little bit more lightly and a little bit more easily. In location 2, individuals who reach this location, there's an increased sense of okayness or well-being, and there's an even greater reduction in the narrative self-thoughts and emotions. The boundary between self and other really seems to blur, and now more of the non-dual kind of language comes forward, where there's really a feeling that everything is in a sense one thing. At least there's no clear boundary between me and other. People tend to feel like their action arises from broader circumstance and process rather than just being agentically initiated. that they feel like they participate in the arising of action rather than it being located strictly in the self. Then in location 3, that tends to be dominated by an emergent kind of meta emotion. In location 2, there was a reduction in negative emotions and an increase in positive ones. But in location 3, there seems to be an emergent meta emotion, which consists of kind of like joy and love and compassion all together as a multifaceted, emotional energetic state. So it tends to be a highly positive experience. Negative emotions can still arise, but they don't usually persist very long. And there's a further reduction in the narrative self, but in that reduction at location 3, whatever remains of the narrative self seems to be felt more acutely. It stands out almost sometimes in a disruptive or painful way when it does arise. There's also an increased sense of divinity or pervasive consciousness. So, in some people in some traditions might experience themselves participating more in the feeling of the divine or God, but others might experience it more just as a psychic continuum, that there's a feeling that there's a consciousness that runs through things, a kind of a panpsychic experience. One of the things that can happen, though, is that there's in location 2, where there's a kind of blurring of self and other in a non-dual sense, or maybe even a monistic kind of sense. At location 3, a sense of self comes back to some degree, and this time it's experienced in experiences of union. That there's more experiences of union, so that there is a more concretely felt sense of self and other, but it's not rooted as much as, or very much at all, in narrative self anymore. One of the things that can happen, though, at location 3 is that people feel that they have a conviction of kind of irrationally arising perception of truth. And it can seem sometimes what they see and what they'll demand and what they'll insist on can seem irrational or inexplicable to other people. And sometimes it can show up in rigid ways, making it a little difficult to get along with location 3 people. For location 4, the narrative self activity tends to drop away altogether. People just report that they don't experience that self narration going on anymore. There's no sense of being that verbal stream, and there's a sense of again of divinity or pervasive consciousness. There's increased non-duality. Self and others seem to be deeply unified. It's some might report that when you and I are speaking, there's no sense of differentiation, but of where the speaking is coming from. In a sense, it all feels to be coming from the same place, the same source, of the same ground. And there's little to no sense of agency. It just feels like spontaneously arising creative action. There's not a sense of being an agent that makes a decision. Decisions happen, but there doesn't seem to be any loss of effectiveness in functionality. In fact, they can be very highly functioning, but there's not a sense of being, again, the agentic initiator of the actions or decisions. But memory at location 4 becomes very unreliable. It's not that it's altogether gone. If you dig and you probe with a location 4 person, they can pull up memories, but it's not readily there. So they can become forgetful and have to get in the habit of writing things down and setting up external props to make sure that meetings and other things kind of happen, because internally it's not going to stay there. There's a greatly magnified sense of well-being and freedom, but because of the radical nature of the changes here, where there's no sense of being kind of the originating agent, and there's no sense of the narrative self, sometimes it's uncomfortable for people to remain here, or it's uncomfortable to others, and people will voluntarily leave this location and drop back to 2 or 3. And sometimes there's a number of people who seem to be relatively fluid in their locations, and they can move between these at will. Location 5, what they've mapped out so far, is more radical still, and it seems to be almost dangerous to enter location 5 without the right kinds of support, because at each level you can say that there's some kind of deconstruction, disassembly, and then reintegration, but it's very intense at location 5. It can even reach down into basic sensory motor functions, basic binding functions in of the senses or the sense of self. All of those things can be temporarily dismantled, and it means that the individuals who are entering that can become non-functional, basically practically non-functional for a time, entering catatonic states, or states of long absorption, or just disordered perception. And again, it could be mistaken from the outside as psychological illness, a definite problem arising. If it's held in the right way, there's a deeper kind of integration that can happen at the far side of that. And I can think of exemplars of I don't know if you've ever heard of Vernon Kitabu Turner. He's like a Zen sword teacher and karate teacher, but he started having increasingly deepening mystical experiences. But it looks like possibly he began to enter zone 5 because he would enter states of profound absorption even out in public. Many people reported that multiple times they would find him sitting 8 hours at the table in the Dunkin' Donuts in complete absorption, and not being able to function, to get up, to do anything. He got lost for extended periods of time in that space before eventually he reconstituted and then emerged with a stable functioning identity. In 5 and beyond, and I'm sorry that this went on so long, but I wanted to get to this because partly what you were talking about before with the different moves that Kierkegaard points at. One of the things that they find with people at location 5 or beyond is that there seems to be 2 different moves available here, where in development and along these locations, they can then proceed without any conventional sense of self returning, but other people can proceed from level 5 and beyond with a sense of self returning. And it's not built on the same foundations as before. It's not built on narrative. It's not built on images. But nevertheless, there's a coalescing sense of self that reemerges at this phase. So even though they've been through the no self dissolution period, it can reconstitute itself in a new way and in a new mode. And so there seems to be 2 parallel paths that can go along in these later zones.
I had the obvious thought of Ramana Maharshi.
Yes.
And the Jnana Yoga tradition of inspecting the narrative self-sense as a means of initiating movement through these various locations you were describing. And certainly in his story, he has a lot of quasi-comatose states, even early on. And so one of the things that intrigues me is a more and more refined understanding of the self-architecture that was already present seems to accompany a lot of shifts of various kinds. And I also thought about when you were describing, I mean, I don't want to reduce it just to this, but earlier when I was discussing bioelectric fields, we literally do have something that runs through our nervous system that also expands beyond our sense of the body and maybe fills up our perceptual field and can allow heightened coordination between the neurological activity here and here, producing general neurocardial coherence, which is a background set of meta emotions, all characterized by that classic spiritual flavor: gratitude, love, emotion, trust. So if we said that the electric field might play a very important role in the constitution of the self, then we could say, oh, these are stages or phases in which that's becoming more clear. I feel more like an invisible center of radiance that permeates all of my perceptions, right? But likewise, I could say, oh, here's the self looking at the self. Let me examine the self. And what happens when I try to examine the self thought in Ramana Maharshi's teaching? Oh, I constantly miss it. I never perfectly stabilize at the self spot, but it turns out that's what the self spot does. And the more clear I am about that little slip past at the level of the narrative self, the more I tend to expand into the post-narrative self. So it really intrigues me that these layers and these moves are not simply larger and larger spheres of inclusion in which more and more complexity can occur. That's partly true, but they're also deeper and deeper refinements of the activity that was already present in the earlier stages.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, and there's I didn't mention that, but I think it's in zone 4, that the sense of, the sense of fundamental okayness that runs through multiple locations, especially at zone 4, there seems to be a sense now of being radiating blessing and okayness, that there's the experience that you're not only participating in an okay world or set of circumstances, but in a sense, it's radiating in and through you. And I think that energetic basis that you're pointing to makes a lot of sense. There's a definite, clear, textual and oral indication, and you and I may have both experienced this in our own ways, but of there actually being a pervasive sense of participation in a greater than body field, that permeates everything, and that can become part of the new locus of identity, where you might still remain within the body in important ways in terms of your own functioning, but at the same time there's a sense of participating in a pervasive field, and you can find textual descriptions of discovery of that field in many traditions over centuries. So it's almost uncanny how clearly field-like those descriptions are.
There's a very interesting, like when you were talking about those locations, I was imagining it as a gradient of irony, right? So at first I'm starting to have a transparent relationship to my self-identity, which affords me some interesting new behavioral and emotional options and a new relationship to my narrative capacities. But down at the other end, when you talked about the self returning for the person who's spent a good deal of time at location 5, one of the things we see is that person returning as if the self they now have is God, right? But that's the self is identified with the total field, whatever that field turns out to be. But it's that they're ironically being the total field rather than ironically being the personal field. And now objectively, those fields could have many different meanings, right? It might be Bohmian in the sense that there's a total information coherence in order to make reality run, and you can tap into that. It might be that it's a purely neuropsychological phenomenon of maxing out. It might be that it's just a bigger one, that your field and activity occurs within, if the Earth has one or the solar system is one, then there is a much bigger thing that has the same rough shape as your self field structure that you could talk as if you were, because that's so obvious to you. Now, it may not be infinite and universal, or it may be, but I think the same phenomenological and procedure elements are at play, regardless of what we think the ontological reality and scope of those fields are.
Judith Blackstone talks about that, I think, in an interesting way. In Yogacara Buddhism, there's a recognition that, what we perceive is mediated by and shaped by consciousness. There can be an ironic holding of that, and as if holding, because you recognize that what is present is at the same time being constructed. And that, parallels movements in, modern intersubjective psychology, which is looking at the self and the self-other relation through the lenses of complexity science and systems theory, and really deeply examining the mechanics and dynamics of the arising of self-structure out of, self-other relations, out of the relational field. And Bohm talked about it, where before we started with points and then imagined connecting lines between them, and now we see more the nest of lines, and their intersections become the nodes, so that the relationality seems to be more primary, and then there's a nodal emergent sense of object and self out of those intersections. Judith Blackstone, in her work, she tries to integrate Yogacara Buddhist perspectives and intersubjective psychology perspectives together into a single mode of understanding the self structure and a mode of therapeutic practice. And one of the things, that they both share in common is that they recognize that perceptions are mediated by consciousness and basically co-constructed. What is different between them is that in Yogacara Buddhism, this is different from, maybe some of the Rangtong schools, but in Yogacara Buddhism, there's a recognition of something more fundamental beyond the constructedness, which is this field-like character. And the way that Judith Blackstone holds it is that you've got to kind of, you can use both approaches in ways that balance and complement each other. People, especially Westerners who tend to pick up on the Buddhist side of things, they'll easily move in the direction of non-duality, but maybe discount human feeling and participation in the personal. They want to move more and more towards that, the universal and the abstract, in a sense. On the side of the intersubjective, they're much more focused on, the arising of the personal out of the relationship, and the importance of feeling and all of that, and the dynamic constructedness of things. But they don't recognize any further horizon of possibility for development beyond recognizing the constructedness of things, right? So she feels like using both in conjunction can be very helpful to not let the individual get lost in, an idealized, spiritualized picture, but also, while using a lot of the tools and insights of intersubjective therapy, recognizing that there may be possibilities for self-constitution, self-identification beyond what is, imagined within that framework that's pointed at, by Buddhism and other mystical traditions. And, like you say, when you get to those places of feeling that you are identified with or participating in those larger fields, I don't know if we can really say, at least at this point very clearly, whether what's going on is we really are participating in those fields outside of the body, or whether just in the way that we put together self and world phenomenologically in our experience, our sense of location becomes distributed through the whole presentational field that we're constructing, rather than just isolated elements within the presentational field, so that there's, we begin to pervade the whole arena that we're phenomenologically generating. So I think, for people who are very suspicious about, the broader, objective or universalizing claims that, we're actually participating in something cosmic, you can still see it in that way. But in either way, I think experientially it shows up, and the effects of that, in terms of the impact on our own experience and how we hold ourselves, it's the same.
Yeah, I think a good explanation has got to be one that affords people the opportunity to embrace it from multiple interpretive backgrounds And I think more and more we might be able to find a language that satisfies both of those equally, and maybe satisfies a few other options as well, such that people can get in on that language without having to affirm any one of them in exclusion from the others. There's a thought that occurs to me, which is where do conversations at the leading edge of thinking about the self need to go? Like, what is a good function for those conversations at this moment in the story of human knowledge? Because it is interesting that people can occupy locations 3, 4, and 5. It's interesting that people can make this radical Kierkegaardian non-dual relational identity with the absolute impossible possibility of all possibilities. Mm-hmm. But I think what we need planet-wide is more and more people at the upper register of the narrative cultural justification self. And we need to build that into our knowledge systems. And I think that's one of the things the Elusive I conversation is doing, is try to bring in the perspective of people who are in that space. Right? Let's at least stabilize at the somatic, existential, plural, integrative, ironic level. And mm-hmm. from there, you can start working on jumping off to some other strange, fascinating points. But we need to at least get to there in a fairly rich, robust, and stable way, and also anchor that as the organizing assumption of our transdisciplinary knowledge as a species. And what are the things that enable the developmental capacity of the self to get there more rapidly, more richly, more organically? How do we become more broadly stable, authentic selves? And this is where I start to think a little bit about character and personality, which is, and I don't mean them in exactly the kind of general psychological sense that Gregg brought up, where there's a cluster of generic personality traits that we might boil down to the big 5, but then there's also how well you do or do not show up as a moral, well put together agent, your character, your personality. I'm trying to describe something like a more nature-based, earlier self process in us, and a more socialized self process, and the way that the deeper integration and cross-pollination of these two selves is an ancient spiritual or esoteric psychology way of talking about building up this balanced, embodied self that we need more of, so that we've got this, children for the first few years of life are characterized by being selves in a way that's different than how teenagers and adults characterize themselves as selves, right? So I have a lot more of my experience when I'm, say, 3 or 2 that's predominated by my physiology, by my inherited characteristics, my instincts, and information and experiments that I'm doing in states of, like, we would call delta and theta states that for an adult would be unconscious states. Mm. And there's a whole rich universe there that largely vanishes from our consciousness as we get a little bit older and we start to encounter highly socialized information that is strongly suggested to us at education, or we start to develop habit procedures and we start to do a lot more sensory processing and experimentation through alpha and beta wave. Mm-hmm. And we largely forget about it. We sense it's there. We know the artists are digging around looking for some authentic material in this other self. But I think this is, to some degree, the root of our nature nurture wondering, right? We are the blankest slate. And because we have this extra software reprogrammability to adapt to our social situations, we have a tension, like most animals don't seem to, between a very large socialized conscious self and a pre-socialized non-conscious self. And there's a theory in esoteric psychology that if you can blend these together more, right, if you can get a more conscious, intelligent appreciation and description of your unconscious and subconscious tendencies and faculties, mm-hmm. and at the same time use your seemingly nonlinear and non-rational responses to help you feelingly evaluate information from the society and from your mind and from your sense observations, that these two working together in a manner that's a little bit similar to how John talks about the prediction layers reflecting on each other, right? If you can set that dialogue up in yourself, I think you have a much richer likelihood of arriving at a broadly stable, broadly self-aware state of selfhood that is amenable to the existential, plural, somatic, and meta-integrative models, and from which you could diverge into spiritual specializations if you wanted to really try out those radical self-transcendences. But I think getting people up to there is important. And I think thinking about it in terms of almost a relationship between the conscious and the subconscious self, and between the social and the biological self is a traditional and effective way to do that for a lot of people.
I think that's right. And it's an emphasis that used to be in Wilber's work in earlier writings and less so now, but when he talked about the centaur, for me, the centaur is that blending of the conscious and the subconscious or unconscious, of the human social and the biological animal, and the bringing up of more of the resources, from early infancy, the autosymbolic imagination, the access to different, brain states that were more, common at that point, different types of somatic sensitivities, modes of being. What I was talking about with Levin, being able to access, earlier, more unbounded and oceanic modes of sensory participation. All of those things can be, that's basically what's considered in Wilber's model as the existential phase of development. That is the border between the personal and social and the transpersonal. And I agree that that's really where a lot of our psychoeducation needs to point us to. And there are different guides within both existential and psychoanalytic and transpersonal traditions that I think have a lot to teach us and help us with that integration. That's really important. And I saw another, just before we got on here, I saw another bit of a dialogue that John is doing where he's talking about mystical experience, and the first conversations were just opening up, basically presenting it as something that is possible, something that is real, that can be experienced. It's not just myth. But then the conversation progressed towards whether it should also be prescriptive, whether we can begin to point to certain types of mystical trainings and experiences, not only as possible and real, but as desirable. And so I think those kinds of conversations are from within the base of cognitive science and Gregg's unified theory of psychology, integral psychology. We can all lay conceptual foundations for the post-metaphysical taking up of these kinds of practices. I don't think there's a need to rush into them. I think there's a great deal to do just to stabilize us at an existential stage of development for most people. And if you follow Washburn or somebody like that, that existential passage can be very harrowing. It's definitely full of its terrors as well as its blisses. It's not easy just to blend and integrate these elements. There's a lot of disruption, a lot of reordering, a lot of confrontation with difficult and existentially challenging experiences and issues and questions. So it's not really for the faint of heart. And we don't have much that prepares us towards that. It'd be nice to have, to build in some ritual structures back into contemporary society that allows for navigating that terrain and preparing to enter that terrain more wisely.
Yeah, I think wisdom and well-being have to be the orientations here. We need good containers, but also only some people will be interested in those more elaborate experiments anyway. That what we really need to focus is on the improved maturational developments of a spiritual existential kind of approach, where the other one is an option but isn't really necessary, but building in the necessary dynamics for a wisdom culture, which make it more likely for people to get to that centauric range. I think that's essential. And everybody's been thinking about that through history, in my view. Like when you think about a wise culture, you think about a moral culture, or I was talking about character and personality, a civilization in which more people have more character, right, which has idiosyncratic, descriptive elements and also some moral elements to it. And I think we have a culture right now using that previous framework where some people are more personality driven, right? They're much more ready to just move forward on the social information they've heard. And other people are more reticent and feel like they should be more anchored in their, let's call it animal nature, but it's not entirely animal, but they want to be more physiological, more invested in the heuristic intelligence of their instincts, and less responsive to the social information they've picked up over the course of their life. And I think there's extreme versions of the person who's more centered in that earlier self. We say of them that they're a real character,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's always showing up as a disjunction with the social space of the other people. But there's a difference between being a character and having character, right? So if we say that you're being a character and you're located in this range of self, and in that range of self, there are the organic seeds of your conscience, of the algorithms or sensings or styles that would evolve into a moral way of being in the world, but haven't necessarily evolved. Then the socialized self has a number of socialized customs, but they aren't really as in contact with those seeds as they need to be. So there's always a sense that they're a little bit inauthentic. But if you can work those together more, then you would be able to, using your conscious practices and knowledge, unfold those primitive moral potentials in a way that starts to organize yourself as an authentic moral agent in the world, whose morality will be peculiar to you, but also definitely obvious to the people around you, right? And that's somehow in that third range, right? That meta balanced integrative range. And that's what people have always sought for, I think, as a civilization. And we can say that it goes along with a planetary, transcultural, transdisciplinary, integrative, pluralistic viewpoint. And that's important. It does go along with that. But the key thing is for people's individual way of showing up in the world as a self to match that system. All right. And to get to that moral, to get to that integrative, to get to that sense of authenticity of the self, and to disperse that as widely and richly as possible in our knowledge systems and in our civilization. I think that's what we need a good model of the self to do for us at this point in history.
Yeah, that's really well put. And I think there are social forces against the development of a robust self in that sense. I think there's some of the ways our economies and our basic social structures are set up that, our governments, I don't want to go too far down that path, but it does feel like there's an investment in keeping people at a certain level that's more malleable. And so, yes, the systems of, culture that have been present that are wisdom oriented, they've all aimed at that. But I think there are definitely structures in place that discourage that because of the utility of having people who are less developed. So that's a social challenge that I think we're going to have to navigate. And one thing I didn't mention about some of the locations that Jeffrey Martin has been mapping, and I think it goes really without saying, but a post-conventionality intensifying so that people, in a sense, become characters. In this sense, they're not just rooted in the earlier animal, but there is a surfacing of that again in a way that allows for activity that basically doesn't have much regard for social convention. And there'd be, I think would be interesting to look at how could we fold that into at least some types of, intensive psychoeducation, not for everybody, but at certain levels. I'm thinking, in Tibetan tradition, they have something called Rushen. And basically, Rushen is helping people. It's a practice to help practitioners dissolve aspects of the social self that interfere with spontaneous self-originated action. So there's a, breaking of taboos and conventions and acting in ways that normally would be, embarrassing or shameful. There's a whole ritual around bringing these unconventional aspects of the self out to exercise them, and then fold it in and integrate it in a healthy way. So I think we probably can and should look, especially from metamodern or integral perspectives, what would be some of the ways that we could do that in our curricula now.
It's interesting to think about we've discussed the role that the self-transcendental threshold or figure or option plays in the structure of the self as an ongoing changing entity. But the role that self-transgression might play in that is very interesting. It comes closer to Nietzsche's notion of self-overcoming as the constitution of the self. And so there might be a lot of very subtle ways to do that. And I think you were saying we don't want to force it on anyone. It's been a luxury item or a rare thing throughout history. But I think there are reasons we might want to make it more apparent and more central at this point, because there's more things trying to hack the self sense than ever before, right? And we're encountering more information and cultural artifacts coming towards us, trying to polarize us. And there's an entire economic system and political system that works a little better if we're easier to hack. Mm-hmm. and more conformist to some degree.
Right.
And we are seeing the negative effects of all of that on people, whether it's their political system, their economic system, their social networking devices. It's making them a little less thoughtful, a little less themselves, so to speak, a little more conformist, a little more gullible, a little more reactionary. And the taboo that I would want to challenge, or the taboo breaking that I think is a really important skill for everyone, including even children, to be working on as part of their education system, is the assumption that we have to take seriously the incoming cultural messages, right? That I, as a self, recognize that, know what it is, know what it means, and should have a reaction to it. Mm-hmm. That's a tight little loop. It has uses in a lot of areas, but when we're receiving more prompts to make us do that than any of our ancestors were evolved to be able to handle, we end up in an information overload situation, or a situation where people are seeing a message that's so emotionally devastating that maybe they kill themselves, and maybe later it turns out it was just randomly generated by a bot somewhere. Right? That sense of semantic differential from the content, I think, is a transgressive act to the self structure that was built up to feel like it knows what it's seeing right away. And I think those sorts of smaller but more pervasive ways of engaging in self-developmental self-transgressions, I think they're going to be really important in setting up a ethos in which people can evolve more securely and more stably to this centauric self we were discussing.
Right. Yeah, I really like the selection of that word, self-transgressive, in relationship to, self-transcendence. And that's definitely what's going on with Rushen. And when I worked at the Krishnamurti school in India, this was folded into the curriculum at high school level. It was always anticipated and mentioned and kind of like entertained at earlier levels of education, but it especially came forward in what they called culture class. I taught a class called culture class, but it's a long traditional thing within the Krishnamurti schools. And basically, it's a class that's designed to help you identify modes of conditioning in the culture and how those modes of conditioning are being replicated within the school environment, and how basically mindfully and in wisdom to transgress those modes of conditioning to arrive at more authentic ways of being. So there's a bit of dynamite in that kind of activity. It's not always easy to contain for an overall institution, but Krishnamurti schools feel that that's really essential and foundational.
It's really interesting that the conversation is swayed into this terrain, because I'm thinking back to John's emphasis on the self-modeling itself as a modeling procedure, and in that it models the world.
Mm-hmm.
But this course you're describing, right, there's a tweak on it that we need in terms of establishing a sense of self-authenticity that has critiqued its way free from the overwhelming social infrastructure. And it has to model itself in the process of getting modeled by external agencies, which is a very similar but slightly distinct version of that process. And without that going on freely circulating in society, then it's going to be much more difficult for people to grow past the level which is currently the most useful level of self to the system that we're running.
Right. I think that's a great point to end on, because it's also over 2 hours. So.
Well, they did 15 or something.
Yeah, right.
I know, you got to go on a trip, and we don't want to get too socially radical at this point.
Yeah, YouTube's watching.
Well, these are fun topics. I like, it may be very abstract and verbose for a lot of people, but I love that we are able to go into the social critique and the mystical experience and the, neurological, cognitive, and developmental, and philosophic and metaphysical. Like, I think we roamed a pretty rich territory.
Yeah, it feels like this also could actually become an Elusive I-like series. There's definitely more to say and more to explore, but I'm glad we at least did this, and I wanted to do it as really homage to their conversation, which was really rich and wonderful.
Yeah, it's nice knowing those guys, and it's lovely seeing them together, and it felt really good to me knowing them, and I really appreciate everything they brought forth, and I feel the same way about you.
Yeah, me too.